That's fine. So I have about 10 minutes to just do a bit of an unpack of the Palm Sunday story. And Palm Sunday is one of those, a bit like Christmas, a bit like Easter. Like, it's one of those sermons that most people who do any church leadership have done lots of times. It's the same passage, the same story every year. It's hard to make it fresh and exciting because you don't discover new events that occurred, because it happened quite a long time ago and it's been fairly well covered. So there's always the question, well, what should I do? Should I just recycle a sermon I've done before? I've done a lot of Palm Sunday talks. I didn't do it last year, so I was thinking, well, I could bring something fresh. And it's important to think about, well, what actually did happen? What are we actually dealing with? And to do, almost to kind of go through the motions of what is Palm Sunday, because we need to remember that. And many of you will know that I like Tim Keller, who died a few years ago, but he's was a Presbyterian pastor in New York. And he preaches a couple of sermons on Palm Sunday, and they're both actually basically the same, but separated by about 10 years. So he's obviously using the same notes. But he says there are 3 C's that we need to remember about Jesus as the king, that he is the coming king, that he is the counterintuitive king, and I've entirely forgotten the other C, not crucified, but I will hopefully remember that later on. But essentially, we need to remember that Palm Sunday is the beginning of the end of Jesus' life. But in that, it's the end of Jesus' life is then the beginning of his new life. So it is the very crux of everything beginning to happen. And so we sometimes forget that it wasn't super normal for someone to just enter into Jerusalem and then be celebrated in the way that he was. But we also, if you look at the Bible passage, and this year we're looking at it in the Gospel of Matthew, which I don't know, have we got the Bibles out? No, the Bibles aren't out. But if you had one of those Bibles, or you can find it on your phone, in Matthew chapter 21, it's marked as the triumphal entry, and it describes all these amazing things coming together. But in the verses running up to it, Jesus orchestrates the whole thing. And we find it sometimes a little bit unpalatable, because we'd like it to be that it just magically happened and everything just sort of came together, and lo, Jesus fulfilled all the Old Testament prophecies. All the things that were said about him just fell into place, and then everything went on as it was supposed to go on. But it's not quite like that, because Jesus really deliberately set things up in such a way so as he would fulfill the prophecies. And that doesn't take away from the fact that he fulfilled them, but he sets it up because he knows what the prophecies are. He knows what he's been called to do, and he knows what's going to happen to him at the end of the week before anyone else knows. As I was thinking about Palm Sunday, I think we often forget actually how the disciples would have been feeling. This is a bit like Christmas. It's a time when everyone goes back to Jerusalem, when they go to a special place to celebrate things, to a significant place to celebrate the Passover. Hands up if you know what the Passover is. It's not a trick question. I'm not going to get you to explain. But the Passover is, for the Jews, the most significant event in the history of their nation, of God saving them, of God coming in and sparing them, but not sparing their enemies, to release them from slavery and lead them ultimately into a land and a life of their own when they live in freedom. And so they would celebrate Passover every year, and this was the moment that they were all entering Jerusalem for, to remember God's faithfulness to them. Everybody was excited and actually looking forward to a bit of a knees up, to a bit of a family get-together. No one was thinking about doing a good bit of killing at the end of the week. That wasn't part of the plan, except possibly for some of the religious leaders who may already have been plotting. But we think most of that came into their heads and really solidified as a plan much later on in the week, not on this day, on Palm Sunday. But what did it mean that God was faithful to them, that they were coming together to remember God's faithfulness? Jesus embodies God's faithfulness by setting up an entry into Jerusalem that ticks all the boxes and says, yes, I am the king that's been promised. But he does it in a counterintuitive way. So you'll know that he was riding on a donkey. And it's not that that had never happened before, but there's a passage in the Old Testament that says the Messiah, the one who's going to come to save us and make everything right, he will come riding on a donkey, even on a colt of a donkey's offspring. This was counterintuitive because that wasn't a powerful place for a king to be. If you were victorious and riding back in from battle, you'd be on your war horse. And I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, Alice preached and reminded us that at more or less the same time as Jesus was entering Jerusalem on a donkey, the Roman seat of power was entering at the other side of Jerusalem on a war horse, in a big ceremony, on a chariot. But people weren't singing "Save Us" to that person. They were singing "Save Us" to Jesus. They were remembering God's faithfulness, looking forward to the Passover and hoping that it would happen again. But I think maybe they'd forgotten the cost of the Passover and perhaps why they needed saving in the first place. And I wonder whether that's true for us as well. When we come to Palm Sunday and Easter and the whole of Holy Week, which is about to happen, do we just sort of go through the motions because it's what we do? Did they celebrate Passover each year because that was what they had to do and because it was a good party and there was great food and it was a family gathering? Or were they truly remembering their need of Jesus, their need of God, and their need for him to save them? When we come to Holy Week, and when we come to Palm Sunday, and then later at the end of the week to those days when we remember Jesus' death and the price he paid, and ultimately the victory that he wins over death, do we remember that just because it's what we do at this time of year, or because we know there'll be eggs at the end of it? Or do we really sit in the need of why we need to remember it? So as we journey through Holy Week this week, I wonder whether we can step into the place that the disciples were in and try to journey through Holy Week without remembering what the final destination is, without constantly thinking that we know what the last scene is going to be, but live in the moment of excitement at this point, of knowing that something exciting is going to happen. This is a counterintuitive moment where Jesus comes in and is riding on a donkey. He's being lauded as a king, but nothing about him looks kingly. And there's an anticipation there. But we've also got to remember that, again, if you look at the verses running up to this story, there's a story where Jesus performs a miracle, and the person he's talking to calls him Son of David, which is a title that says that he is the Messiah. And every time up until this point in the Bible, in Jesus' life, he has told people to be quiet. He said, no, don't say that. Don't call me that. It's not my time yet. This is the first moment when we see full fat, not semi-skimmed Jesus, where he comes out and he says, yes. He just says, yes, that's me. I'm going to live completely into who I've been called to be because now is the time. Can you imagine how exciting that would have been for the disciples, as well as confusing and worrying? And then as we roll into Holy Week, we find lots of those famous stories. Jesus turning the tables in the temple. We hear Judas finally deciding that he's going to betray Jesus. We have Holy Communion instituted on Maundy Thursday. We have the events of Good Friday. How can we walk through those events as though they were happening for the first time and know that Jesus is our King? The striking thing about Palm Sunday is how quickly things change. On the Sunday, everyone's singing Hosanna, save us. But by the time it comes to Jesus being crucified, just based on the numbers alone, a whole heap of those people were also shouting, crucify him, about the same person. The crowd is really enthusiastic, but they're not really committed to the cause. They are impressed by his entry and by the situation they're part of, but they're not really submitted and surrendered to who he is. And so I wonder also, as we walk through today and Holy Week and we ask what it would be like if we didn't know what happened in the end, what will this king be for you? Because Jesus doesn't really leave us the option of just thinking he's quite a nice guy. He only gives us the option of a no or a yes. Are you for him or not? And if you're not, then you're against him. We see that he is very humble, but Tim Keller describes him as being the only person who is humble and yet not modest. So he's bold, and he is strong in his claims of who he is. He isn't just a good teacher or an inspiring figure. He doesn't look for, I quite like Jesus, he's a nice guy. But instead, he's wanting us to trust him, to follow him, and to let him be king. And so on Palm Sunday, when we're full of excitement, perhaps we're also full of a misunderstanding. The crowd welcomes Jesus, but not quite for who he really is. And so as you welcome Jesus, whether you know him yet or not, are you welcoming for who he really is? For who you'd like him to be? Or for who someone else has told you he is? This is a king who comes gently, but he saves deeply, and he calls for our whole lives, for everything. And he wants us to respond not just with words, shouting Hosanna on Sunday today, but with actions and with trust, trusting in him even as he dies and seems to have lost everything on Friday. So I suppose, who is Jesus to you today? Who is this king? Is he the king of your life? Is he just another king? Or is he someone else's king? And what are you going to do about that? How do you change? How do you make Palm Sunday fresh and real again in your life this year, if it's your 30th, 40th, maybe, year of doing it? And if it's your first year, then let's look on this king and see the ways that he is calling us to follow him, waving palm branches and just asking, what's next? Submitting ourselves to him.